In 1870, Nevada seethed with the discovery of America's greatest silver deposits. Silver Creek, a settlement born overnight, drew thousands of desperate men seeking fortune, but where lonely men and easy money converged, dark opportunities emerged. The Golden Rose Parlor House promised to be different from the filthy, dangerous brothel of the region, a luxury establishment run by three sisters who offered dignity and safety to their employees. For 8 years, the Golden Rose was considered the most refined and discreet brothel in Silver Creek. The Everheart sisters achieved respectful tolerance from the community through their discretion, charitable contributions, and impeccable public behavior. It was one of the most consolidated businesses in town, operating without the scandals or disturbances that characterized other similar establishments. But in 1878, when the building was finally excavated following an investigation, a macabre discovery shocked not only Nevada, but the entire country. Beneath the ornamental garden and in the basement of the elegant house, the remains of 97 young women were found. This is the story of how three sisters built an empire of psychological horror, operating what may have been the first documented case of organized serial murder by women in America. A story that questions our perception of predators, victims, and human nature in its darkest form. If you're watching from some small town, leave a comment telling us where you're from. Stories like this may have happened closer to you than you imagine. And if this narrative intrigues you, subscribe to the channel because we'll dive deep into the most disturbing details of this case. Silver Creek was born, like so many other Silver Rush towns, an explosion of tents and shacks that quickly transformed into a prosperous community. By 1870, the population had jumped from 0 to nearly 1,000 inhabitants in just 2 years. Most were men, miners, merchants, adventurers, and opportunists from all corners of America, seeking the silver fortune that lay in Nevada's mountains. Among the newcomers were three sisters who introduced themselves as Greta, Wilhelmina, and Margot Everhart. They came, according to them, from a respectable Boston family that had lost everything in the Civil War. Greta, the eldest at 35, possessed an imposing presence, tall with dark hair always pulled back in an impeccable chignon and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate every person she spoke with. Wilhelmina, 32, was the opposite, small, delicate, with a sweet smile and a soft voice that calmed anyone. Margot, the youngest at 29, often remained silent, observing everything with an intensity that some found disturbing. The sisters arrived with considerable resources and immediately purchased land in the highest part of Silver Creek, an area overlooking the entire town. There they built what would become known as the Golden Rose Parlor House, a 2-story building with refined Victorian architecture, ornamental gardens, and furniture imported from the East. The establishment stood out dramatically from the rustic brothel and dirty taverns that dominated the city. What made the Golden Rose truly unique was the Everhart sisters' philosophy. They didn't hire local women or experienced prostitutes. Instead, they placed advertisements in newspapers in distant cities, offering dignified work as companion ladies for refined men. The ads promised generous salaries, comfortable accommodations, protection from violence, and the opportunity to save money for a better future. Although the nature of the establishment was known to all, Greta Everhart achieved a unique position in the community. She attended the Methodist Church every Sunday, contributed generously to charitable works, and organized social events for Silver Creek's most prominent families. She spoke eloquently about the importance of offering dignified opportunities to women in distress, especially orphans and Civil War widows who had nowhere to go. The first employees of the Golden Rose arrived in the autumn of 1870. Sarah Mitchell, a 19-year-old from Ohio whose parents had died of tuberculosis. Emma Caldwell, 22, a war widow from Tennessee. Mary O'Brien, 20, an Irish orphan from New York. All arrived with small luggage and great hopes, attracted by promises of a new beginning in a safe and respectful environment. The first month seemed to confirm all promises. The young women were well-dressed, well-fed, and appeared satisfied with their conditions. They lived on the second floor of the Golden Rose in individually decorated rooms with good taste. During the day, they helped maintain the house and received etiquette lessons taught by Wilhelmina. At night, they kept company with clients, businessmen, mine owners, and prosperous merchants who paid high prices for the establishment's sophistication. Reverend Marcus Webb of the Methodist Church visited the Golden Rose several times at Greta's invitation to offer spiritual guidance to the young women. He later described the environment as surprisingly orderly for an establishment of such nature. The women seemed well cared for, spoke politely, and showed gratitude for the opportunities they received. Webb only noted that they seemed somewhat reserved, but attributed this to the natural shyness of young women in a new situation. Dr. Henry Ashford, Silver Creek's young physician, also visited the Golden Rose regularly for health examinations of the employees. He observed that the women were exceptionally healthy and well-nourished, but noticed something peculiar. They rarely made direct eye contact and responded to questions almost mechanically, as if they had rehearsed their answers. When he questioned Greta about this, she explained that she trained the young women to be discreet and professional. What began to intrigue some residents was the turnover of employees. Every few months, some young women would leave for better opportunities and be replaced by new candidates. Greta explained that many achieved advantageous marriages or jobs in larger cities, thanks to the social skills they developed at the Golden Rose. It was a plausible explanation in an era of great social and geographical mobility, but there were details that didn't fit perfectly. Martha Henley, owner of the fabric store, noticed that the Golden Rose employees never bought materials to sew personal clothes or gifts to send to families. Thomas Brennan, Silver Creek's young sheriff, observed that he never saw the women at the train station when they supposedly left town, and Mrs. Elilana Fitzgerald, who ran the post office, began to find it strange that the Golden Rose employees never sent or received correspondence. These details, however, were easily explained or ignored. Silver Creek was a city in explosive growth, where people constantly arrived and departed. General prosperity masked small inconsistencies, and the Everheart sisters' reputation as operators of a discreet and well-managed business discouraged deeper questioning. After all, they maintained the most refined establishment of its category, contributed to the community, and avoided the scandals that characterized other brothel. The first sign that something was truly wrong came from an unexpected source. In March 1871, a miner named Jack Sullivan sought Sheriff Brennan with a disturbing story. He had fallen in love with Sarah Mitchell and wanted to marry her. When he proposed marriage, Sarah accepted with tears in her eyes, but said she needed permission from the Everheart sisters. Days later, Greta informed Sullivan that Sarah had changed her mind and decided to leave for San Francisco with a better job proposal. Sullivan insisted on saying goodbye to Sarah, but was told she had already left during the early morning hours to avoid unnecessary emotional scenes. Something in Greta's coldness and refusal to allow him to see Sarah one last time aroused suspicion. Sullivan began asking questions around town, but discovered that no one had seen Sarah leave or knew details about her new opportunity in San Francisco. This was the first loose thread in a carefully woven tapestry of lies, but in a town where the word of the Everheart sisters carried more weight than the suspicions of a lovesick miner, Sullivan's doubts were easily dismissed. The Golden Rose continued operating normally, receiving new young women, and maintaining its reputation as a refined and well-managed establishment. What no one knew was that at that exact moment, Sarah Mitchell lay buried in the Golden Rose's ornamental garden alongside other young women who had left for better opportunities, and that the Everheart sisters were just beginning to perfect a system of psychological predation that would operate for 7 more years, claiming 97 young lives in the process. During these early years, the Golden Rose established itself as one of Silver Creek's most consolidated businesses. While other establishments faced problems with violence, drunkenness, and public scandals, the Everheart sisters maintained an operation that was impeccable on the surface. Their clients were influential men who appreciated the location's discretion and sophistication. Revenue was constant, problems non-existent, and reputation solid. But beneath this facade of commercial success, a system of horror was being meticulously constructed. Each employee who arrived full of hope became a piece in a deadly game where the rules were dictated by predators who had transformed hospitality into a trap and benevolence into a mask for the deepest evil. During the following 2 years, the Golden Rose consolidated its position as Silver Creek's most refined and discreet brothel. Although the nature of the establishment was known to all, the Everheart sisters achieved respectful tolerance from the community through their discretion, charitable contributions, and impeccable public behavior. It was one of the town's most consolidated businesses, operating without the scandals or disturbances that characterized other similar establishments. The sisters expanded their operations, building an additional wing and increasing the number of employees to 15 young women. Each new arrival followed the same pattern. Young women without close family from distant places attracted by advertisements promising dignity and opportunity. The sisters' selection process was meticulous. They preferred orphans, young widows, or women who had broken with their families. Greta personally corresponded with each candidate, asking detailed questions about their family situation, social connections, and future plans. Under the pretext of ensuring that only women of good character were accepted, she actually identified those whom no one would look for if they disappeared. Vilmina developed what she called a refinement program for new employees. During the first weeks, the young women went through an adaptation period that included lessons in etiquette, diction, and social behavior. On the surface, it seemed like benevolent training to improve the women's prospects. In reality, it was a systematic process of psychological isolation and resistance breaking. The program began with apparently reasonable rules. Employees could not leave the Golden Rose without permission and accompaniment for their own safety in a town full of rough men. Personal correspondence was reviewed by Vilmina to ensure they maintained a respectable image. Contact with outsiders was discouraged because it could distract them from their personal growth objectives. Dr. Ashford, during his monthly medical visits, began to notice subtle changes in the employees' behavior over the years. The young doctor, who had arrived in Silver Creek in 1870, now had more experience and observed with more critical eyes. Women who arrived animated and hopeful gradually became quieter and more submissive. When he commented on this to Greta, she explained it was natural. The young women were maturing and learning to behave like refined ladies. Ashford accepted the explanation, but noted in his personal diary that the women seemed strangely uniform in their mannerisms. The true genius of the Everheart sisters' system lay in its gradualness. They didn't break their victims' resistance all at once, but through a slow and almost imperceptible process of psychological erosion. Small freedoms were removed one at a time. Privileges were granted and then withdrawn for minor infractions. The young women were constantly evaluated and compared to each other, creating an environment of competition and insecurity. Maro, the youngest sister, proved particularly skilled at applying psychological punishments. She never shouted or used obvious physical violence. Instead, she used isolation, food deprivation, subtle humiliation, and emotional manipulation. A young woman who questioned a rule might be isolated in her room for days, being told she was reflecting on her ungrateful attitude. Another who showed homesickness might have her letters lost in the mail. The reward system was equally manipulative. Young women who completely adapted to expectations received small luxuries, a new dress, a special dessert, an afternoon of supervised freedom in the gardens. These rewards created emotional dependence and made other employees strive to please the sisters, even if it meant abandoning their own identity. In 1872, a young woman arrived at the Golden Rose who would become central to understanding the Everheart sisters' system. Rebecca Hayes, 21, was the daughter of a Methodist pastor from Indiana who had died in an accident. Intelligent and observant, Rebecca kept a secret diary during her months at the Golden Rose, a document that would be discovered decades later and provide disturbing insights into the establishment's operations. Rebecca's first diary entries were optimistic. She described the Golden Rose as elegant and well-organized, and the Everheart sisters as refined women with genuine concern for their employees' welfare. But gradually the tone changed. Rebecca began to notice inconsistencies in stories about employees who had left for better opportunities. She observed that these women never said goodbye personally and that their personal belongings remained in their rooms for weeks before disappearing. A particularly revealing entry dated September 1872 described a conversation Rebecca overheard between the sisters. Wilhelmina said Mary was becoming problematic and that perhaps it was time for her to move on. Greta replied she would wait until after Dr. Ashford's visit. Margot just smiled in that strange way that gives me chills. I don't understand why Mary would be problematic. She always seemed one of the most obedient. Rebecca also documented the constant surveillance system at the Golden Rose. The sisters always knew where each employee was and whom they spoke with. Private conversations between the young women were discouraged, and any sign of conspiracy or negative attitude was quickly punished. Employees were encouraged to report inappropriate behavior from each other, creating an atmosphere of mutual distrust. The most sinister aspect of the system was how the sisters identified when an employee was becoming problematic. Signs included asking too many questions about employees who had left, expressing desire to visit family, showing resistance to rules, forming close friendships with other employees, or showing signs of depression or despair. Ironically, both total submission and open resistance could be fatal. In October 1872, Rebecca witnessed something that terrified her. An employee named Catherine Walsh had been isolated in her room for a week for disrespectful attitude. When Rebecca asked about Catherine, Wilhelmina said she had decided to leave during the night to reflect on her choices elsewhere. But Rebecca had heard Catherine crying in her room the night before and knew she had no money or resources to travel. Rebecca's last diary entry, dated the 15th of November, 1872, was desperate. "I'm beginning to understand that perhaps none of us will leave here alive. The sisters aren't benefaces, they're predators. But how can I prove it? How can I escape? They control everything, our money, our correspondence, our movements. If I try to flee and I'm caught, I know I'll be the next to leave for a better opportunity. God help me. I'm trapped in a nightmare disguised as a dream." Rebecca Hayes disappeared 3 days after this entry. Greta informed the other employees that Rebecca had received a marriage proposal from a Denver merchant and left immediately to not miss the opportunity. Her diary was hidden behind a loose board in her room, where it would remain concealed for more than a decade. The Everheart sister system was now fully operational. They had created an environment where vulnerable young women were systematically isolated, psychologically broken, and when they became inconvenient or dangerous, silently eliminated. And the most terrible thing was that all this happened under the facade of a respectable and well-managed business in a community that saw the sisters as competent operators of a discreet establishment. During this period, Dr. Ashford began to notice patterns in the symptoms he observed during his monthly visits. Certain employees developed what he described as deep melancholy, loss of appetite, pallor, apathy, and a strange resignation. He prescribed tonics and recommended rest, without suspecting he was documenting the effects of gradual arsenic poisoning that the sisters administered to weaken their victims' resistance. Reverend Webb also noticed changes during his pastoral visits. The older employees seemed to have lost the capacity for genuine personal reflection, responding to spiritual questions with rehearsed and empty phrases. When he tried to deepen conversations about faith and hope, responses were evasive, as if the women had been trained to avoid any discussion that might reveal their true mental state. If you're following this story and haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the perfect moment. We're just beginning to unravel the horrors of the Golden Rose, and the most shocking revelations are yet to come. Between 1873 and 1878, the Golden Rose reached its operational peak. The Everheart sisters had perfected their system to the point of eliminating virtually any risk of discovery. Employee turnover was explained as natural progression, young women who grew professionally and left for better opportunities. The small community of Silver Creek not only accepted this narrative, but celebrated it as proof of the sisters' refinement program's success. But patterns began to emerge for those observant enough to notice them. Thomas Brennan, now an experienced sheriff after 8 years in office, kept meticulous records of all Silver Creek residents. His files showed that since 1870, a concerning number of young women had left the Golden Rose for various destinations. Brennan's initial records documented 23 departures until 1875, but he suspected the real number was higher, as some employees may have arrived and left without official record. None of the women who supposedly left had maintained contact with acquaintances in town. None had returned for visits, and most disturbing, none had been seen at the train station or main road during their supposed departures. Brennan began noting these inconsistencies, creating a personal file that grew each year. Dr. Ashford, now an experienced physician after years practicing in Silver Creek, also began to notice disturbing medical patterns. During his monthly examinations, he observed that certain employees developed specific symptoms in the weeks before their departures: dramatic weight loss, extreme pallor, hand tremors, and a deep apathy he initially attributed to pre-travel anxiety. When he questioned the sisters about this, they explained it was natural. Young women became nervous before major life changes. Reverend Webb made a particularly disturbing observation during a pastoral visit in 1876. He noticed that the Golden Rose's older employees seemed to have developed a disturbing spiritual uniformity. They all spoke of God and providence in almost identical ways, using phrases and expressions that seemed rehearsed. When he tried to have deeper conversations about faith and hope, responses were evasive and superficial, as if the women had lost the capacity for genuine personal reflection. The true nature of the Everheart sisters' system began to be revealed through an unexpected source. In 1878, a minor fire at the Golden Rose damaged part of Greta's office, forcing her to hire a local carpenter for repairs. James Morrison, a skilled craftsman, discovered during the work a collection of documents that Greta had tried to hastily hide. Morrison was a simple but literate man. The documents he found left him deeply disturbed. They were detailed files on each employee who had passed through the Golden Rose, containing information far beyond what would be necessary for a normal commercial establishment. Each file included detailed psychological evaluations, complete family history, identified emotional vulnerabilities, and most sinister notes on resistance levels and problem potential. A typical file referring to a young woman named Helen Porter contained observations like orphan, since age 14, no known relatives, submissive personality but tendency toward melancholy, responds well to approval but shows excessive attachment to other employees. Risk medium monitor social interactions. The file ended with a notation in red ink. Resolved. November 1877. Morrison found files on dozens of women who had supposedly left the Golden Rose. All ended with the same red ink notation, resolved, followed by a date. The dates corresponded exactly to periods when employees had supposedly left Silver Creek for better opportunities. Even more disturbing were documents detailing what the sisters called the transition protocol. It was a meticulous manual describing how to identify employees becoming unsuitable for the environment, how to gradually isolate them from others, how to prepare convincing explanations for their departures, and how to finalize the transition without arousing suspicion. The protocol revealed the Everheart sisters' calculating coldness. They had categorized their victims into psychological types and developed specific strategies for each category. Melancholic types were isolated until they developed severe depression, at which point their sudden departure seemed like desperate flight. Questioning types were gradually discredited before other employees before being eliminated. Social types were separated from their friends and punished for forming factions before disappearing. Morrison was paralyzed by what he had discovered. He understood he was looking at evidence of multiple murders, but also knew no one would believe him against the word of the Everheart sisters, who operated one of Silver Creek's most consolidated businesses. He decided to secretly copy the most incriminating documents and seek Sheriff Brennan with concrete evidence. When Morrison showed the documents to Brennan, the sheriff initially reacted with skepticism. The Everheart sisters were established figures in the community, operators of a discreet business, and generous contributors to charitable works. The idea that they were serial killers seemed absurd, but the documents were too detailed to be forgeries and corresponded perfectly to patterns Brennan had observed over the years. Brennan decided to conduct a discreet investigation. He began verifying stories about employee departures, sending telegraphs to major cities connected to the telegraph network, and investigating whether any of the women had actually reached mentioned destinations. The results were disturbing. No train station in major cities had records of tickets purchased by any Golden Rose employees. No hotel or boarding house in destination cities had records of their arrivals. Brennan's investigation also revealed inconsistencies in the sisters' own stories. Greta had given different versions about various employees' destinations when questioned at different times. Wilhelmina had mentioned thank you letters from former employees but could never produce these letters when requested. Moreau, when questioned directly, frequently claimed not to remember details about specific employees. The decisive moment came when Brennan discovered Rebecca Hayes's diary. During a discreet search of the Golden Rose, he found the hiding place behind the loose board and recovered the diary documenting the young woman's final months of life. Rebecca's observations provided an internal view of the sisters' psychological control system and confirmed Brennan's worst suspicions. But even with growing evidence, Brennan faced a dilemma. The Everheart sisters were influential in Silver Creek's small community. They had important allies among local merchants and considerable financial resources. A premature or poorly founded accusation could destroy his career and allow the sisters to escape justice. He needed irrefutable physical evidence, the victims' bodies. Brennan also discovered that the sisters maintained correspondence with women in various cities, suggesting their operations may have begun before arriving in Silver Creek. Letters found in Greta's office indicated contacts in at least 3 other western cities, raising the possibility that the total number of victims was much higher than documented in Nevada. In September 1878, Brennan made a decision that would change everything. He obtained a search warrant based on documentary evidence and organized a systematic excavation of the Golden Rose Gardens. What he found confirmed his worst fears and shocked even experienced investigators. Beneath the ornamental garden, carefully maintained by the Everheart sisters, lay the mortal remains of dozens of young women. The discovery of the bodies marked the end of the Everheart sisters' respectable facade, but it also revealed the truly terrifying extent of their operations. They weren't simply opportunistic killers. They were systematic predators who had transformed murder into an efficient commercial operation, operating under the protection of social respectability and community trust. The excavation of the Golden Rose Gardens began at dawn on the 23rd of September, 1878. Sheriff Brennan had assembled a team of 6 trusted men, including Dr. Ashford, to examine the mortal remains, and Reverend Webb, to offer prayers for the victims. What they discovered in the first hours of excavation exceeded their worst expectations and revealed the true extent of the horrors perpetrated by the Everheart sisters. The first bodies were found at just 2 meters deep, buried in shallow graves beneath the ornamental rose bushes that gave the establishment its name. Dr. Ashford, based on symptoms he had observed in life and the condition of the mortal remains, determined the victims had died by strangulation or poisoning. Even more disturbing, many bodies were found with small personal objects, necklaces with engraved names, family rings, brews, and religious medals that the victims had brought from their previous lives. As excavation continued, a macabre pattern emerged. The Everheart sisters had organized their clandestine cemetery with the same meticulousness they applied to all aspects of their operations. Bodies were arranged in orderly rows, each marked with a small numbered stone. It was as if they maintained an inventory of their victims, treating murder as an accounting matter. In the Golden Rose basement, investigators made even more disturbing discoveries. Behind a false wall, they found a secret room that functioned as the sisters' archive and operation center. Walls were covered with maps marking cities where they had placed recruitment advertisements, lists of newspapers that published their ads, and detailed schedules of their operations. The archive contained correspondence with hundreds of young women from across the country. Letters revealed how the sisters selected their victims with surgical precision. They preferred orphans, young widows without children, and women who had broken with their families. Each letter was carefully analyzed to identify emotional vulnerabilities and social isolation. Women with close families or strong social connections were politely rejected. Even more shocking was the discovery that the Everheart sisters maintained detailed financial records of their operations. They profited not only from employee services, but also from their personal belongings, which were discreetly sold in distant cities. Jewelry, fine clothes, and other valuable objects were catalogued and sold through a network of contacts the sisters had developed over the years. Dr. Ashford made a medical discovery that revealed another sinister aspect of the operations. Based on symptoms he had observed during years of medical visits, he concluded many victims had been gradually poisoned with arsenic, a substance the sisters administered in small doses to weaken employees' physical and mental resistance. This explained the depression and apathy symptoms he had observed in weeks before the young women's departures. Reverend Webb found something that deeply disturbed him as a man of faith. Among the documents was a diary kept by Wilhelmina detailing her psychological manipulation techniques. She had studied psychology and religion specifically to develop more effective methods of mental control. The diary contained observations like religious guilt is particularly effective with Catholic orphans and isolation, followed by false compassion breaks resistance faster than direct punishment. Investigators also discovered that the sisters had developed false identities and escape routes in case they were discovered. They maintained forged documents, hidden money, and contacts in other cities who could help them disappear. The plan was meticulous and suggested they always knew their operations would eventually be discovered. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators found what the sisters called the Development Archive. It was a collection of photographs and drawings documenting their victims' physical and mental deterioration. Over time, the sisters had systematically recorded how isolation, manipulation, and gradual poisoning transformed vibrant young women into apathetic shadows of themselves. Photographs showed the same terrible progression in dozens of victims. Initial images showed smiling, hopeful young women. Subsequent photographs revealed gradual weight loss, empty stares, and submissive postures. The final images in each series showed women who seemed to have completely lost the will to live exactly the state the sisters desired before finalizing the transition. Investigation revealed that the Everheart sisters weren't simply killers, but sadistic researchers who studied the effects of different forms of psychological torture. They experimented with isolation techniques, sensory deprivation, emotional manipulation, and behavioral conditioning. Each victim was an experiment, each death a research conclusion. Among the most shocking documents was correspondence revealing that the sisters had operated similar schemes in at least 3 other cities before arriving in Silver Creek. Letters from associates in Colorado, California, and Oregon suggested a network of operations that may have resulted in hundreds of deaths over a decade. When news of the discovery spread through small Silver Creek, the community's reaction was shock and denial. Many residents refused to believe that the operators of the town's best-managed establishment were capable of such horrors. Some suggested the bodies belonged to prostitutes who had died of disease or accidents. Others claimed evidence had been planted by the sisters' enemies. But evidence was irrefutable. Detailed records, numbered bodies, victims, personal objects, everything confirmed that the Everheart sisters had operated a serial murder system for 8 years, eliminating any employee who became inconvenient or dangerous to their operations. The final count was devastating. 97 bodies were found in the Golden Rose Gardens and basement. 97 young women who had come to Silver Creek seeking a better life and found only death at the hands of predators disguised as benefaces. It was one of the most extensive serial murder cases ever documented in America, perpetrated by women society considered incapable of such violence. Dr. Ashford, examining the mortal remains, discovered evidence that some victims had tried to resist or escape. Broken bones indicated physical violence when psychological control failed. Wrist marks suggested some women had been tied up. The most disturbing discovery was a skeleton found in a position suggesting the victim had been buried alive. Reverend Webb, cataloging personal objects found with bodies, discovered never-sent letters hidden in small boxes buried with some victims. These letters, written in the young women's final moments of life, contained a desperate pleas for help and confessions of terror. One letter written by a young woman named Margaret Sullivan said, "If anyone finds this, know that the Everheart sisters are demons disguised as angels. They kill us slowly, stealing our souls before taking our lives." But when investigators went to arrest the Everheart sisters, they discovered they had disappeared. The Golden Rose was empty, abandoned as if its owners had simply evaporated. The hunt for America's most wanted killers was just beginning. The discovery that the Everheart sisters had fled triggered the largest manhunt in Nevada's history up to that point. Sheriff Brennan immediately sent telegrams to authorities in major cities connected to the telegraph network, providing detailed descriptions of the 3 women and warning of their extreme danger. But the sisters had planned their escape with the same meticulousness they applied to their murders, and seemed to have disappeared completely. Investigation of the escape revealed that the sisters had begun preparing to flee weeks before the body's discovery. Local residents reported unusual nighttime activity at the Golden Rose, with wagons arriving and departing during early morning hours. The local bank confirmed that Greta had withdrawn large amounts of money in previous weeks, claiming she was investing in establishment improvements. Dr. Ashford made a disturbing discovery when examining the sisters' abandoned rooms. Wilhelmina had left behind a personal diary, revealing even darker aspects of her personality. Entries showed she viewed her victims not as human beings but as specimens for her psychological experiments. One particularly shocking entry read, "Sarah demonstrated exceptional resistance to isolation. I increased arsenic dosage and observed accelerated deterioration. Satisfactory results obtained in 12 days. The diary also revealed that the sisters had discussed expanding their operations to other cities. They planned to establish a network of refinement houses throughout the American West, each operating under the same respectability facade while systematically eliminating vulnerable women. The Silver Creek discovery had interrupted what could have become a mass murder operation of unimaginable proportions. 3 months after the escape, the first clue about the sisters' whereabouts came from an unexpected source. A Sacramento merchant reported selling supplies to 3 women matching the Everhart's descriptions. They had bought provisions for a long journey and asked about routes to Mexico. The merchant noticed one of the women, probably Margot, seemed nervous and constantly looked over her shoulder. The clue led investigators to a boarding house in Stockton, California, where the sisters had stayed for a week using false names. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Catherine Mills, described the 3 guests as refined women, but with something disturbing in their gazes. She noticed they never went out together and seemed to be constantly watching each other, as if they didn't completely trust one another. Mrs. Mills made an observation that would prove prophetic. The youngest of the 3 seemed terrified of the other 2. She cried at night, and I heard her murmuring desperate prayers. When they left, I found a note hidden under the mattress that said only, "God, forgive me for everything I've done." The sisters' trail led investigators through California toward the Mexican border, following a more logical route: Sacramento, Stockton, Fresno, Los Angeles, and finally toward the border. They had left a trail of small clues, hotel records, supply purchases, witness sightings, but they always remained a few days ahead of their pursuers, as if they had information about the investigation's movements. In January 1879, the hunt came to a dramatic and unexpected end near the border town of Tijuana. Mexican authorities found the bodies of 2 women matching Greta and Wilhelmina Everhart's descriptions. They had been shot to death, apparently during a violent argument. Near the bodies was a 3rd woman, seriously wounded but still alive: Margot Everhart. Margot was taken to a hospital in San Diego, where she remained under police guard while recovering from her injuries. During her convalescence period, she made confessions revealing even more disturbing details about the Golden Rose operations. According to Margot, the murder system had been entirely conceived by Greta, who possessed a cold, calculating intelligence that impressed even her sisters. Wilhelmina, Margot revealed, was the trio's true sadist. She obtained genuine pleasure from victims' psychological suffering and often prolonged the breaking process far beyond what was necessary for their operations. Margot claimed she herself had been coerced into participating in the murders through blackmail and threats from her older sisters. Margot's confessions revealed that the sisters had begun their criminal activities long before arriving in Silver Creek. They had operated similar schemes, though on a smaller scale, in at least 3 other cities. The total number of victims could be much higher than the 97 found in Nevada. Margot also revealed the motive for the fatal argument that resulted in her sisters' deaths. Greta and Wilhelmina planned to continue their operations in Mexico, establishing a new refinement house in a city where authorities could be easily corrupted. Margot, tormented by guilt and fear, had threatened to surrender to American authorities. The argument escalated to violence when Greta tried to kill Margot to permanently silence her. During the shootout, Margot managed to kill her 2 sisters in self-defense, but was seriously wounded in the process. She claimed her last thoughts before losing consciousness were of relief. Finally, the nightmare had ended. Margot also revealed details about how the sisters had developed their methods over the years. They had started with only 1 or 2 deaths per year in their previous operations, but gradually increased the scale as they perfected their techniques. In Silver Creek, they had achieved what Greta called maximum operational efficiency, eliminating an average of 12 victims per year without arousing suspicion. Margot Everhart's trial in 1879 was one of the most sensational in California's history. Due to the nature of crimes having occurred in Nevada, she was extradited to face justice in the state where the murders happened. The trial in Carson City attracted national attention, with journalists from across the country covering the case of the repentant killer sister. Margot was charged with complicity in 97 murders, but her defense argued she had been coerced and manipulated by her older sisters. Witnesses described Margot as the most reluctant of the trio, often seen crying after murders. Her lawyer presented evidence that she had tried to save some victims, discreetly warning them of danger, though unsuccessfully. During the trial, Margot provided horrifying details about the sisters' methods. She described how Greta had developed a scoring system to evaluate the risk each employee represented. Women who asked too many questions, showed signs of resistance, or formed strong emotional bonds with other employees received high scores and were marked for elimination. Wilhelmina, according to Margot, had created what she called the farewell protocol, a 3-week process that psychologically prepared victims for death. The protocol included gradual isolation, reduced feeding, administration of arsenic in increasing doses, and emotional manipulation to induce despair. The goal was to make victims completely lose the will to live before being killed. The most disturbing aspect revealed during the trial was that the sisters maintained detailed records not only of their victims, but also of their murder techniques. They experimented with different methods: strangulation, poisoning, drowning in bathtubs, and documented which was most efficient and least likely to leave evidence. Margot also revealed that the sisters had developed a network of contacts in various cities who helped them dispose of evidence and establish alibis. Some of these contacts were other criminals, but others were respectable citizens who had been blackmailed or corrupted. Discovery of this network led to several additional arrests in 3 states. The jury, after deliberating for 3 days, reached a complex verdict. Margot was found guilty of complicity in murder, but received a relatively light sentence of 25 years in prison due to mitigating circumstances and her cooperation with authorities. The judge declared that while she was guilty of participating in the crimes, there was sufficient evidence that she was also, in a sense, a victim of her older sisters. Margot served 18 years before being released for good behavior in 1897. During her imprisonment, she became a devout Christian and worked as a nurse in the prison infirmary. Guards and other prisoners described her as a genuinely repentant woman who dedicated each day to penance for her crimes. After her release, Margot Everhart completely disappeared from public life. Official records indicate she legally changed her name to Margaret Evans and moved to a small rural town in Oregon. Rumors suggested she had become a nun in a remote convent, dedicating the rest of her life to caring for orphans and women in distress. Other accounts claimed she had established herself as a teacher in a rural school, where she was known for her special kindness to children who had lost their parents. Regardless of which version was true, all accounts agreed she lived as a recluse, tormented by guilt until her natural death in 1923. The Golden Rose was demolished in 1885, 7 years after the body's discovery. Silver Creek never completely recovered from the scandal. Population decreased dramatically as families moved away, embarrassed by having been deceived by the Everhart sisters. Many businesses closed and silver mining itself went into decline in the region. The site where the establishment stood remained empty for decades, considered cursed by local residents. Several attempts to build new structures on the land failed due to strange accidents and workers' refusal to continue projects. Eventually, the area was transformed into a small memorial park. The 97 victims of the Everhart sisters were buried in a special cemetery built with donations from the community and people across the country who were shocked by the case. Each grave received a headstone with the victim's name and the inscription, "Lost but not forgotten." The cemetery became a pilgrimage site for families who had lost daughters under mysterious circumstances, many hoping to find answers that would never come. The Everheart sisters' case established important precedents in criminal investigation and understanding of serial killers. It was one of the first documented cases of women operating as systematic predators, challenging social perceptions about gender and violence. It also demonstrated how social respectability and community position could be used as disguise for the most heinous crimes. Investigation led to significant changes in laws about entertainment establishments and protection of vulnerable women. New regulations required more detailed employee records, regular inspections by authorities and communication systems so women could maintain contact with their families. Dr. Ashford, deeply affected by his involuntary participation in the crimes, dedicated the rest of his career to studying poisoning and developed some of the first protocols for detecting arsenic in living patients. His work saved countless lives and established foundations for modern forensic toxicology. Reverend Webb left Silver Creek's Methodist Church and became an advocate for women's rights, traveling the country to speak about dangers vulnerable women faced and the need for social protection. He established several shelters for women in distress, always with rigorous supervision systems to prevent predators from infiltrating. But perhaps the case's most disturbing legacy is the question it raises about how many other similar operations may have existed without ever being discovered. In an era of great social mobility and limited communication, how many young women disappeared under similar circumstances? How many other respectable establishments hid unimaginable horrors? Subsequent investigations revealed that at least 6 other suspicious cases in different states may have involved methods similar to the Everheart sisters. Though never completely resolved, these cases suggested the sisters may have inspired imitators or that a broader network of predators operated under similar disguises. The story of the Everheart sisters and the Golden Rose remains one of the most disturbing cases of systematic predation in American history. 97 young women lost their lives at the hands of killers who transformed hospitality into a deadly trap and respectability into a disguise for unimaginable horrors. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the scale of murders, but the calculating coldness with which they were executed. The Everheart sisters weren't impulsive killers driven by passion or madness. They were methodical predators who studied, planned, and perfected their methods over years. They transformed murder into a commercial operation, treating human lives as commodities to be exploited and discarded. But perhaps this tragedy's most important lesson is how it exposes our tendency to trust appearances and social positions. The Everheart sisters managed to operate for 8 years because society couldn't conceive that operators of a well-managed business and community contributors could be capable of such horrors. This social blindness allowed them to continue their operations far beyond what should have been possible. Today, when we hear about young people disappearing under mysterious circumstances, when we see establishments promising opportunities for vulnerable people, when we encounter respectable figures who seem too good to be true, perhaps we should remember the Everheart sisters. Remember that the most dangerous evil often wears virtue's mask and that our compassion and trust, though essential virtues, can also be exploited by those who see human goodness as weakness to be manipulated. The 97 young women who died at the Golden Rose weren't just victims of killers. They were victims of a social system that failed to protect the vulnerable and allowed predators to operate under respectability's protection. Their deaths remind us that constant vigilance and protection of the most vulnerable aren't just legal responsibilities, but moral imperatives every society must embrace. The cemetery where victims were buried still exists today. Though Silver Creek became a ghost town decades after the scandal, headstones worn by time and Nevada desert weather still bear the names of young women who came west, seeking dreams and found only nightmares. Occasional visitors report a deep sadness that permeates the place, as if the air itself still carries echoes of prematurely interrupted lives. Modern criminological studies classify the Everheart sisters as one of the first documented cases of organizational serial killers, predators who transform murder into a systematic operation with both psychological and financial motivations. Their case is studied in policemies and criminal psychology courses as an example of how predators can use respectable social institutions as camouflage for criminal activities. But beyond academic interest, The Golden Rose story remains a haunted reminder that the deepest horror often arises not from obvious monsters, but from people who manage to hide their true nature behind warm smiles, tempting promises, and impeccable reputations. It's a story that forces us to question our own perceptions about good and evil, about trust and suspicion, about human nature in its darkest manifestations, and perhaps somewhere in the vast expanses of the American West, buried secrets still wait to be discovered, other respectable houses with well-tended gardens, other establishments promising opportunities for the desperate, other predators who learned from the Everheart sisters that the best camouflage for evil is the appearance of good. The Everheart sisters' story ends, but the questions it raises remain eternally relevant. How do we protect the vulnerable? How do we identify disguised predators? And how do we ensure tragedies like the Golden Rose never repeat in the silent darkness of social respectability? These are questions each generation must answer anew, because the price of forgetting can be measured in lost young lives and dreams buried in ornamental gardens that hide unimaginable horrors. Did this story make you question how many predators might be hiding behind respectable facades today? Share your thoughts in the comments. Leave your like if the case impacted you and subscribe for more disturbing psychological mysteries.